Over 30,000 years ago, in the unforgiving darkness of the Ice Age, a silent pact was made. A wild wolf stepped out of the freezing shadows and sat by a human's fire. In exchange for warmth and scraps of meat, the wolf offered its speed, its senses, and its absolute, unquestioning loyalty. It was the beginning of the greatest friendship in the history of our planet. We shaped them. We named them. We brought them into our homes. And for 30,000 years, they never broke their promise to protect us. But in the freezing winter of 1941, humanity broke that promise in the most unimaginable, cruel way possible. The Eastern Front, World War II. The Soviet Union was collapsing under the unstoppable weight of the German war machine. Massive, impenetrable steel monsters known as panzer tanks were crushing the Soviet lines. The Red Army was out of anti-tank weapons. They were out of time. And in their absolute desperation, they turned to man's best friend. They did not use highly trained elite military purebreds. They scoured the freezing streets of Moscow and villages, rounding up the strays, the forgotten, the hungry, the dogs who only wanted a warm hand to pet them. They were thrown into dark trucks and taken to secret military camps. But they were not sent there to be guard dogs. They were sent there to become weapons. To make the weapon work, the military scientists had to manipulate the dog's most basic instinct: survival. The training protocol was brutally simple. First, they starved the dogs. For days, these innocent animals sat in the freezing cold, their ribs showing, whimpering for food. Then, the instructors would start the engines of massive Soviet tanks. The roar of the engines was deafening, terrifying. Everything a dog's instincts told them to run away from. But beneath the tracks of those terrifying metal monsters, in the dark shadows, the soldiers placed a single piece of meat. Driven mad by starvation, the dogs overcame their absolute terror. They crawled under the roaring tanks to eat. Day after day, the process was repeated. Slowly, their brains were rewired. They were taught a fatal lie: that the loud, terrifying metal machines were the only place to find food and safety. Once the psychological manipulation was complete, it was time for the final piece of the puzzle: the canvas harness. It was a heavy vest strapped tightly to the dog's chest and ribs. Inside the canvas pouches were 12 kilograms of high explosives. And sticking straight up from the dog's back was a wooden lever, a trigger. If that wooden lever was pushed backward, like when a dog crawled under the low clearance of a tank chassis, it would detonate the explosives instantly. When the soldiers strapped these heavy vests onto the dogs, the animals didn't panic. They didn't know they were wearing death. They simply wagged their tails, looking up at the soldiers, hoping this meant it was time to eat. But the battlefield is not a controlled training camp. When the dogs were deployed to the actual front lines, they stepped into a sensory nightmare. Artillery shells shaking the earth, the smell of burning flesh, gunpowder, and blood. The dogs were utterly terrified. And then came the ultimate tragic flaw in the Soviet plan. A flaw born of human oversight. The dogs had been trained using Soviet tanks that ran on diesel fuel. But the approaching German tanks ran on gasoline. To a dog's highly sensitive nose, a German tank smelled completely alien. It smelled wrong. It didn't smell like the food they were promised. Confused, deafened by the gunfire, and paralyzed by fear, the dogs made a heartbreaking decision. They didn't run toward the German tanks. They turned around and ran back to the only thing they trusted. They ran back toward the Soviet trenches, toward their handlers, seeking comfort, seeking a familiar face in the madness. Imagine the sheer, paralyzing horror of the Soviet soldiers, watching their own dogs wagging their tails, sprinting back into the crowded trenches, carrying 12 kilograms of live explosives on their backs. The soldiers screamed. They tried to run, but the dogs, thinking it was a game, followed them. And as they brushed against the trench walls, the wooden lever caught. Entire Soviet platoons were wiped out by their own terrified pets. The military was forced to issue a new, devastating order. Every anti-tank dog that turned around had to be shot by their own handlers before they reached the trenches. The German army quickly realized what was happening. They issued orders to their machine gunners: shoot every dog on sight, regardless of whether it wore a harness or not. Thousands of innocent animals were slaughtered in the crossfire, caught between an enemy that feared them and masters that betrayed them. The anti-tank dog program was eventually quietly phased out. It is a dark, uncomfortable footnote in military history, a moment we try to forget. Because the true tragedy of the four-legged bombs is not just that they died in the cold snow. The ultimate tragedy is what was going through their minds in their final seconds. They didn't die for a flag. They didn't die for an ideology. When they ran under those machines, they didn't know they were weapons. They just thought they were finally going to get fed. They died wagging their tails, thinking they were being good boys.